I think that the trajectory speaks for itself. We've won a lot of by-elections of the ANC. I think that in all reality, when you look at Pretoria or Tshwane, as an example, you're sitting at about 39% in a local government vote. I think, and when you look at Gauteng and Johannesburg, that's 35. Those are two big metros in the city. I think the ANC is fully aware of the fact that they're below they're below 60%, which is not common for the ANC. They've dipped below that. I think we mustn't also make the mistake of thinking that political change comes through incremental growth. So you grow by 2% now, you grow by 4% now. This is a political game. And in essence, a number of events take place that reshape the landscape of politics. And potentially change can come. And so I think we're feeling quietly optimistic in terms of the hard work that we're doing. I think that we've proven a model of government that seeks to deliver. And I think South African politics, the further we move away from 94, just on a timeline perspective, is when people are sitting and realizing that actually democracy is about putting bread on the table, putting lights on, making sure there's sanitation and all of those things.
Sure. But you see, it's interesting because I think those are two different philosophies. Then if you listen to what Ralph is saying, he's saying that the DA must be a political home, or at least must prove to be a political home. And you seem to be suggesting that people don't necessarily want a political home, but they want somebody who's going to put bread on the table. In other words, services are more important than a political home. Am I understanding you correctly?
No, I think it's a both-and argument. I think we're seeing significant numbers of people come across and join. Our membership roll is increasing, certainly here in Gauteng. I think it used to be uncommon to walk around the townships and see someone in a blue T-shirt. Now, it's become a fashionable thing. So even though people may not necessarily join, but I think they're mentally in their own headspace doing that. And I think also what we mustn't forget is that coming into 2014, you're getting 3 million new voters who perhaps have not voted in 94. And maybe for them, apartheid acts as a memory for them. I know a generation that lives today still experiences the effects of apartheid, so nobody can deny that fact. But there's a generation of voter who's coming on board, who's looking for a new home. So we can't just simply rely on the fact that there's a historic legacy on the table. There's a sense where these young people who are turning 18 for the first time will vote in 2014.
And I'm getting a sense that you're counting on these 3 million people, because what you need as the DA in order to win Gauteng, as I understand it, is 1 million voters. 1 million more than what you already have.
Sure.
So you're hoping that out of these 3 you will be able to get 1 million.
Certainly, and I think indicators are positive. As I say, I think Ekurhuleni, for argument's sake, did exceptionally well in terms of new voters coming on board. So we did Mogale City. So I think we're certainly within striking distance in terms of where things are. And Gauteng voters are learning that they need a new government. So we are dependent on the fact that these new voters that are coming on board, but we're doing hard work in terms of communities. You know, I was in Pretoria South about 2 days ago, and while I was there in Soweto, you're hearing people saying, actually, we want a change. We want a new difference. And so even amongst that generation of people, they're coming on board saying, we want to ship votes. So that's going to be the hard work going forward, is to ensure that in the entrenched structures where people are experiencing issues, they can move across.
But people will also be looking at Cape Town. And some of the Facebook posts that I've been reading here and some of the emails, people are looking at Cape Town and saying, well, there are stories coming out of Cape Town, stories of racism, stories of exclusionism, stories of if you're rich, then you are looked after, but if you're poor, nobody cares about you. And those stories will count in Gauteng, don't you think?
Undeniably. But let me set the record straight. I think there is a propaganda machinery that seeks to say Cape Town is racist and other provinces are not, which is fascinating when you consider the fact that the inward migration in towards Cape Town from all races is at an all-time high. So people are preferring to live in what they're now calling this racist place. And more than anything, I think racism is an illness that is within our society. We must accept that fact. It's not resided exclusively in one place. It's a national footprint. But second to that, when you look at the delivery mechanisms in terms of that, let me cite one story. When you look at the Western Cape's education department, for the first time this year in the top 10, the schools that have outperformed, if you were to split them down into 5 quintiles, you discover that the schools that have outperformed any other are schools who are the poorest of the lot, who historically come from from black communities. So you're finding that there's a lot of infrastructure built that is going into black communities. And in fact, our education system is proving that black schools are performing better. In fact, the increase in the Western Cape from where it is now to 82% actually emerges out of the fact that all our traditional black schools have done exceptionally well.
The argument about in-migration, and Ralph, I'm going to bring you in here. Some may say, well, maybe you're just pushing it, because the fact that it is racist does not mean that people won't go look for opportunities because of the reality of where they come from. If you're in a desperate place such as the Eastern Cape, you say, well, I'm prepared to close my eyes as long as I'm going to get a job.
I want to refute that fact, because I think it's inaccurate to say that the Western Cape is racist. I think racism is everywhere.
But there are
the command stop.
organizations that have done research in this area, and they have said black people feel out of place in the Western Cape.
But if you go to Mpumalanga, the Human Rights Research Council has indicated that there are new levels of racism that are on the go. I'm not here to deny the fact that there's elements of racism in the Western Cape, but I'm also willing to say that there are elements of racism everywhere else in the country. And we must deal with the illness of racism right at its core. We must ensure, when you look at government policy, and ensure that there is no sense where there's an allocation of resources that is equitable and in fact favorable towards communities that are poor. So I think it's not a fundamental policy of us. It's a principle of saying racism is a national pandemic.
And again, I think the important point you're making when it comes to allocation of resources, racism mustn't be seen in that prism. It mustn't be seen there.
And isn't practiced at all. And that's why I'm citing the example of the fact that we've invested quite heavily. I think even if you went to our communities where informal settlements, the process of formalization of informal settlements is highest within the Western Cape rather than any other province. When you look at the process of infrastructure and transport development, there's better. Because here's another way. When you think about Joburg, for example, how do we combat racism is to create access points for people to get access to one another in combating apartheid legacy of separation. The best way to do that as a justice issue is to ensure that we actually provide a transport network that gets people access to one another. And we've invested heavily in making sure that our transport mechanisms give people opportunity and access to one another. So from a government policy point of view, we've systematically worked harder at making sure that we combat the structural effects of racism.
And the reason why we're discussing these things, Ralph, is simply because everyone has said and everyone knows that the DA has had a problem penetrating traditionally black communities and black voters in the past, simply because of the relationship. People see the DA as a white organization. How then, in your view, do they turn that around? How do they change that perception?
I mean, this is exactly why we tend to focus on the Western Cape. And the reason why we focus on the Western Cape is not because we want to point out the weaknesses of the DA, but it's because the DA itself has taken the Western Cape as a kind of a model of governance that they should, that they have continued to package themselves as the party that stands for. And if you look at the Western Cape, the greater challenge they have is the duality of the Western Cape. You've got a sea point side which is thriving and other areas which are thriving very well. And the reason why those other areas are thriving very well is not entirely because the DA is extraordinarily capable, but it's because in more affluent suburbs the economic system is capable of taking care of the situation there in most cases, like it is the case in Johannesburg, in some of the affluent suburbs of Sandton and all. The structural problem seems to be bare in your Gugulethu and your what you can call your traditionally black township, where if the DA is going to emphasize that it stands for a progressive model of governance, you want to look at how is it performing, particularly in those areas. Talk about social cohesion, for example, in Western Cape. I mean, that's quite a challenge. I lived in Western Cape for a couple of years, and what you have in Western Cape in terms of the social cohesion and the way in which people cohere or fail to cohere in the city, you've got a particular group of people along racial lines confined to a particular space, and you've got particular people confined to a particular space. My question there, or my concern, is how is the DA going to communicate to those people who feel they are on the outlier, the outskirts of the city? And to be able to communicate to them, you have to go beyond infrastructure, for example. You have to be able to learn to have a discourse that will engage those people. And you cannot escape the question of race, I think, in this particular matter.
Undeniably, there's a process that's already ongoing at the moment. In fact, I was with the Minister of Economic Development in the Western Cape, and they've They've instilled a program where they engage in communities in terms of a dialogue about racism. And I think there's an honesty in terms of saying, let's have a discussion about it. I think that furthermore, we must be able to have a frank conversation about saying, wait, when you look at, besides the issue of infrastructure spend, when you look at social upliftment in terms of communities, because I think when it comes to the issue of the restoration of the dignity of our people, so that I stand first and foremost as an individual, as a South African, as a black South African who is proud, without feeling that there are structural issues that undermine me, we have to ensure that in those communities, Guguletu, Langa, etc., we deliver services. And I think it was the Cocta report that seek to argue to say that in terms of access to water, in terms of access to electricity and sanitation, those issues are in place. So that when we enter the discussion table, we enter with our dignity still intact as human beings. And so I think those are fundamental issues that you need to be able to put into place so that the discussion about racism actually emerges out of a healthy place rather than one that is also unequal. Furthermore, when you look at our BE spend, when you look at the metro such as Cape Town, and when you look at the municipality of the Western Cape, over 70% of our allocations actually go to previously disadvantaged individuals, which we are placing forward the argument to say that when we do the allocations, we must empower people so that they come on board as human beings who are fully empowered, who are business savvy. But we don't want to stop there. We've equally in our 8% growth policy project have argued quite strongly that actually there's a broader business savvy that is out there that's not just dependent on government. How do we make sure we empower those entrepreneurs to go through the processes? I mean, we do things like the red carpet system so that we try and deal away with red tape so that an entrepreneur can come into the space to be able to compete, so that we create individuals who are empowered. Because our ideological perspective is to say we're an open opportunity society, which seeks to say that let's create a society that is open for all so that people can compete equally and fairly, and ensure that we give them the best service we can get them.